Billionaire Vincent Johnson sat rigidly in first-class seat 2A of the transcontinental flight from Los Angeles to New York, his face flushed with exhaustion and embarrassment as his 6-month-old daughter Harper screamed at the top of her lungs. For nearly 3 hours, every passenger on the plane had been subjected to the relentless crying that no amount of money, influence, or desperation seemed able to stop. Vincent had tried everything. He had walked the aisles bouncing Harper, offered her bottles that she violently rejected, changed her diaper multiple times in the claustrophobic airplane bathroom, and even played white noise through his phone pressed against her tiny ear. Nothing worked. The other first-class passengers were shooting him increasingly hostile looks. Flight attendants had offered polite suggestions that failed miserably. Even the pilot had made a carefully worded announcement about ensuring all passengers enjoy a comfortable journey, which Vincent knew was directed specifically at him. That's when something unthinkable happened. A young black boy from the economy section walked up the aisle toward Vincent's seat. His clothes clean but clearly worn, his posture careful and deliberate. Without asking permission or introducing himself, the boy stopped at Vincent's row, his dark eyes focused on Harper with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so young. "May I?" he asked quietly, his soft voice somehow cutting through Harper's desperate wails. Vincent was so exhausted and defeated that he didn't even question why a stranger, let alone a child, was offering to help. He simply nodded, too tired to care about protocol, propriety, or what anyone else might think. The moment the boy's hands touched Harper, something miraculous happened. The screaming stopped. "Before we continue, would you trust a stranger with your baby on a flight? Hit that subscribe button. Smash the like. If you want to know what this boy did next, stay with me. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because what happens in the next 5 seconds will change everything." Complete, absolute silence fell over the entire airplane cabin as 200 passengers held their breath, waiting to see if this impossible quiet would last. The boy was holding Harper with a confidence that seemed startling for someone his age, gently applying pressure to specific points on her back, while humming a soft, rhythmic melody that Vincent had never heard before. Harper's eyes, which had been squeezed shut in distress for hours, slowly opened and focused on the boy's face. For the first time since takeoff from Los Angeles International Airport, she looked calm, peaceful, almost content. "How did you?" Vincent whispered, staring at this mysterious child who had accomplished what trained nannies and expensive pediatric consultants could never achieve. The boy smiled gently, still holding Harper with practiced ease. "She's got gas trapped high in her chest," he said quietly. "You were holding her at the wrong angle. My little cousins had the same problem back in Fresno. Took me months to figure out what actually worked." Vincent looked around the cabin and saw something that made his heart race with disbelief. Every single passenger was staring at them, not with annoyance anymore, but with amazement and profound relief. Some were leaning into the aisle to get a better view. Others were wiping tears from their eyes. A woman in seat 4C was holding her hand over her mouth in astonishment. But what shocked Vincent most was what he noticed about this young man who had just performed what felt like a miracle with his daughter. The boy's backpack was faded and patched with different colored fabric. His shoes were worn through at the toes. His jeans were too short for his growing frame. Yet there was an intelligence in his eyes, a quiet dignity in his posture, and a gentleness in his hands that seemed far beyond his years. "Who are you?" Vincent asked, his voice filled with wonder and something that felt uncomfortably like shame. The boy looked Vincent directly in the eyes with a maturity that was startling. "My name is Bryan Wilson," he said simply. "I'm traveling alone from Fresno to Newark to live with my aunt. I've been taking care of my younger cousins since I was 8 years old." Vincent felt his world shift as he realized that the person who had just saved his sanity and his daughter's comfort wasn't some trained professional or wealthy peer with access to the best childcare knowledge money could buy. He was a poor kid from Central California, traveling alone, carrying everything he owned in a patched backpack. But as Bryan continued to hold Harper, who was now making soft, contented sounds against his shoulder, Vincent had no idea that this chance encounter was about to reveal a story of responsibility, sacrifice, and wisdom that would challenge everything he thought he understood about worth and capability. And neither of them knew that what happened next would force Vincent to confront the assumptions he had carried his entire life about who deserves respect, who possesses real knowledge, and what it truly means to have power. Vincent Johnson was the 41-year-old founder and CEO of Johnson Real Estate Holdings, a company worth over $6 billion that specialized in luxury commercial development across major American cities. He was traveling to New York for a crucial investors' meeting that could determine the future of his company's expansion into Manhattan's most competitive real estate market. Normally, Vincent traveled with an assistant, reviewing contracts during flights and conducting conference calls from 35,000 feet with the efficiency that had built his empire. But this trip was catastrophically different because his wife Diane was overseas closing an art gallery acquisition in Paris and couldn't care for their 6-month-old daughter Harper. "I can postpone the New York meetings," Vincent had told Diane during their video call the night before his flight. "Absolutely not," Diane had replied firmly from her hotel room in the 6th arrondissement. "This deal represents 18 months of negotiations, Vincent. You cannot miss this presentation. Take Harper with you. How difficult can it be to manage a baby for a 3-day business trip?" Vincent had hired the most expensive childcare agency in Greenwich to find a qualified nanny who could travel with them to New York. But the nanny had texted at 4 in the morning on the day of the flight with a family emergency that made travel impossible. With no time to find a replacement and too much pride to admit defeat by canceling his meetings, Vincent found himself boarding a plane to New York with a 6-month-old baby, virtually no hands-on parenting experience, and a presentation that could make or break his company's future. For the first 45 minutes of the flight, Harper had been perfect. She slept peacefully in the first-class bassinet that the flight attendant had set up while Vincent reviewed financial projections and architectural renderings on his laptop. He began to think that his wife had been absolutely right. How difficult could this possibly be? Then Harper woke up screaming with an intensity that seemed impossible for such a small human being, and Vincent's confidence evaporated completely. He tried feeding her the bottle that Diane had carefully prepared and labeled with instructions, but Harper rejected it violently, turning her head away and crying even harder. He tried changing her diaper in the airplane bathroom, a claustrophobic nightmare that left him sweating and flustered, but Harper continued screaming with renewed desperation. He tried walking the aisles, bouncing her gently the way he had seen Diane do countless times, but Harper's cries only got louder and more frantic with each step. The flight attendants offered suggestions with professional smiles that couldn't hide their growing concern about the disruption to other passengers. "Sometimes babies just need to cry it out," one attendant suggested diplomatically, her tone carefully neutral. "Have you tried playing some white noise?" another offered, bringing Vincent a small tablet with ocean sounds and gentle rainfall. "Would you like me to warm the bottle to a different temperature?" a third asked, clearly grasping for any solution that might restore peace to the cabin. Nothing worked. Harper screamed with an intensity that seemed to vibrate through the entire airplane, her tiny face red and wet with tears, her small fists clenched with distress that Vincent couldn't understand or relieve. As the hours passed, Vincent became increasingly aware of the hostile atmosphere developing around him in the first-class cabin. In seat 1C, prominent investor Margaret Chen was making increasingly loud sighs and checking her diamond watch dramatically every few minutes. "This is precisely why children shouldn't be allowed in first class," Chen muttered to her business partner loud enough for Vincent to hear clearly. "Some people have no consideration for others who paid premium prices for a peaceful flight." In seat 3B, hedge fund manager Robert Sterling was typing aggressively on his laptop, probably sending emails to colleagues about the inconsiderate parents who were ruining his ability to work. "If you cannot control your child, you should not bring them on an airplane," Sterling said to his assistant, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is completely unacceptable." Vincent felt his face burning with embarrassment and anger that had nowhere to go. These were people from his own social circle, wealthy, influential individuals who attended the same charity galas and exclusive industry conferences that Vincent frequented. They should understand that sometimes circumstances beyond your control create impossible situations. But their judgment felt particularly harsh because Vincent was struggling with something he had always assumed would come naturally once he became a father. He was a brilliant businessman who could negotiate billion-dollar deals, manage hundreds of employees, and outmaneuver competitors in the most ruthless real estate market in America. Yet he couldn't figure out how to comfort his own 6-month-old daughter. The most painful part was watching Harper's distress and feeling completely helpless to fix it. Every wail seemed to be expressing not just physical discomfort, but a deeper need that Vincent didn't understand how to meet, a language he had never learned to speak. As the flight progressed past the 2-hour mark with no improvement, Vincent began to panic about more than just the immediate situation. He had 3 days of crucial business meetings in New York, presentations to investors who would determine whether his company could secure the financing needed for the Manhattan expansion. He couldn't bring a screaming baby into boardrooms filled with potential partners and stakeholders. His entire business strategy could collapse if he couldn't figure out how to care for Harper properly. What Vincent didn't know was that several rows behind him in economy class, Bryan Wilson had been listening to Harper's cries with growing concern and recognition. Bryan was traveling to Newark alone, carrying a backpack containing his few possessions and a one-way ticket purchased with money his aunt had wired after months of careful saving. Moving to Newark was his chance to finish high school in a better district, an opportunity that could change not just his future, but his entire family's trajectory. Bryan came from Fresno, where he lived with his mother, grandmother, and 3 younger cousins in a small apartment near the highway. His mother, Patricia, worked double shifts at a packaging plant to support the family, while his grandmother, Ruth, cared for the children during the long hours when Patricia was gone. For the past 6 years, since Bryan was 8 years old and his aunt had her first baby, Bryan had been the family's primary childcare backup whenever his grandmother needed help or his mother worked overnight shifts. 2 of his younger cousins, twin girls named Maya and Sophia, had been colicky infants who cried for hours every day and night during their first year of life. The family couldn't afford to take the babies to specialists or purchase expensive treatments and specialized formula. So Bryan had spent countless nights researching infant care, learning about gas relief techniques, and experimenting with different approaches to soothe his cousins when nothing else worked. Through months of trial and error, patience born from necessity, and careful observation, Bryan had eventually figured out a combination of gentle pressure points, specific holding angles, and calming techniques that could stop the twins crying within minutes. Bryan's got magic with babies, his grandmother would say with pride whenever neighbors asked how the family managed. That boy understands what they need before they even know themselves. As Bryan listened to Harper's screams echoing through the airplane cabin, he recognized the same type of desperate, high-pitched crying that his cousins had exhibited when gas was trapped in their chest and couldn't release properly. He knew that sound. He knew what it meant. He knew how to fix it. But he also knew how it would look for a poor black kid from economy to walk up to first class and approach a wealthy white man's baby. He knew the assumptions people would make, the suspicion he would face, the risk he was taking just by standing up. For several long minutes, Bryan sat frozen in his seat, his hands gripping his knees, his heart pounding with the familiar weight of being seen as a threat rather than someone trying to help. But Harper's cries got worse, more desperate, more painful to hear. Bryan thought about his cousins, about the relief on his grandmother's face when he could finally calm the babies after hours of everyone's exhaustion. He thought about how helpless that man in first class looked, how defeated, how scared. Bryan took a deep breath, stood up, and started walking toward the front of the plane, knowing that what happened next would either help or humiliate him in front of 200 strangers. Bryan Wilson had learned to make himself small long before he understood why it mattered. He sat in seat 23F, pressed against the window of the economy section, his thin frame barely taking up half the narrow seat. His hands rested folded in his lap, fingers interlaced, thumb rubbing slowly against thumb in a rhythm he had developed years ago to keep himself calm and still. He wore a faded red t-shirt that used to belong to his older cousin Terrence, jeans that were getting too short at the ankles, and sneakers held together with careful stitches his grandmother Ruth had sewn by hand 3 weeks ago. His backpack sat wedged beneath the seat in front of him, stuffed with everything he owned that mattered. 2 changes of clothes, a notebook his 8th grade teacher had given him, a photograph of his mother and grandmother, and the address of his aunt's apartment in Newark written on a piece of paper folded inside his wallet. Bryan had been traveling alone since 6 that morning, taking a city bus to the Fresno airport 2 hours early because he was terrified of missing his flight. He had never been on an airplane before. He had never been outside California. He had never been away from his family for more than a single night. The fear of doing everything wrong, of drawing attention, of making someone angry or suspicious, sat heavy in his chest like a stone he couldn't cough up. So he did what he always did. He made himself invisible. He kept his eyes forward. He didn't ask questions. He didn't complain when the man next to him spread into his space. He just breathed slowly and watched and waited for the flight to be over. But he couldn't make himself deaf. Harper's crying had started almost 3 hours ago, and Bryan had recognized it immediately. Not just generic infant distress, but the specific high-pitched, breathless wailing that meant trapped gas pressing against a baby's diaphragm with nowhere to go. He knew that sound, the way other kids knew their favorite songs. He had lived with it for months when his cousins Maya and Sophia were infants, back when he was 8 years old, and his Aunt Lorraine had moved in temporarily after losing her apartment in Bakersfield. The memories came back sharp and clear. Nights when both twins screamed in tandem, their tiny bodies rigid with pain, while his grandmother paced the apartment holding one baby, and Bryan held the other. His mother coming home from her shift at the packaging plant at 2 in the morning, exhausted and desperate, begging Bryan to try something, anything, because she had to sleep before her next shift started at 6. Bryan staying awake until dawn, researching on the library computer during his lunch period at school, reading about infant digestive systems and gas relief techniques, trying different holding positions and pressure points until he finally figured out what worked. The relief on his grandmother's face when he could calm the babies in under 5 minutes. The way his mother hugged him and called him her little miracle worker. The weight of being needed settling onto his shoulders like a coat he couldn't take off even after the twins grew out of their colic and his aunt moved to her own place. Bryan listened to Harper's desperate cries echoing from first class and felt that same weight pressing down again. He knew he could help. He knew exactly what that baby needed. But he also knew what would happen if he stood up. A poor black kid walking from economy toward first class, approaching a wealthy white man and his baby. He knew the looks he would get, the suspicion, the fear, the way flight attendants would position themselves between him and the passengers he was trying to reach. He had seen it 1,000 times in stores, in parks, in every space where people who looked like him weren't expected to belong. Stay invisible, a voice in his head warned. This isn't your problem. You'll just make it worse. But Harper's cries got sharper, more desperate, the kind of sound that meant a baby had been suffering for too long. Bryan thought about Maya and Sophia, about how it felt to finally give them relief after hours of pain. He thought about that man in first class, defeated and helpless, probably a good father who just didn't know what his daughter needed. He thought about his grandmother's voice saying, "If you can help somebody, and you don't, that weighs on your soul heavier than any risk." Bryan's heart hammered against his ribs. His palms were sweating. Every instinct he had learned for survival told him to stay seated, stay quiet, stay invisible. But he couldn't. Not when he knew he could stop that baby's pain. Not when staying silent felt worse than whatever judgment he might face. Bryan took a slow, deep breath, unfolded his hands, gripped the armrests, and pushed himself to standing. The aisle stretched ahead of him like a canyon he had to cross. His legs trembled. His throat felt tight, but he started walking anyway, one careful step at a time, toward the crying that wouldn't stop and the help that nobody expected from someone who looked like him. Vincent pressed the call button above his seat for the 4th time in 20 minutes, his thumb jabbing the plastic with increasing desperation. When the lead flight attendant, a woman named Cheryl with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, appeared in the aisle with a strained smile, Vincent didn't wait for her to speak. "I need to know if there's a private area where I can take her," Vincent said, his voice tight and urgent. "A crew rest area? Maybe the galley? Anywhere that's quieter. I'll compensate the airline for any inconvenience. Name the amount." Cheryl's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in her eyes. a flicker of exhaustion that Vincent recognized from employees who had reached the limit of their patience. "Sir, we don't have any private spaces available on this aircraft," she said carefully. "And our priority right now is ensuring the comfort of all passengers. I understand this is difficult, but perhaps if you could try walking with her toward the back of the cabin." Vincent felt his jaw tighten. "I've been walking with her for 2 hours," he said, hearing the edge creep into his voice. "That's not working. What I need is a solution, not suggestions I've already tried. Isn't there something else you can do?" Harper screamed louder, as if responding to the tension in his voice. Other passengers were turning in their seats now, no longer trying to hide their irritation. Cheryl glanced past Vincent toward the rows behind him, clearly calculating which problem to prioritize: one upset billionaire or 30 angry passengers. "Sir, I'll see what I can find that might help," Cheryl said, her tone shifting from diplomatic to firmly professional. "But I need you to understand that we're doing everything we can within the limitations of the aircraft." She turned and walked away before Vincent could respond, leaving him standing in the aisle holding his screaming daughter while the weight of public judgment pressed down from every direction. Vincent returned to his seat, his face burning. He had built a $6 billion empire by solving problems that other people said were impossible. He had turned abandoned warehouses into luxury developments, negotiated deals that other investors said would never close, convinced city councils to approve projects they had initially rejected. Money had always been the universal key that unlocked every door, smoothed every obstacle, made every problem disappear. Until now. In seat 1C, Margaret Chen leaned toward her business partner, a man named Gordon Fisk who managed a private equity fund Vincent had pitched to 3 years earlier. "This is absolutely inexcusable," Chen said, her voice cutting through Harper's cries. "Some people think money entitles them to subject everyone else to their personal chaos. If he can't handle basic parenting, he shouldn't be flying commercial." Gordon nodded in agreement, his expression cold with disgust. "I've got a conference call in 40 minutes that I'm supposed to prep for," he said loudly enough for Vincent to hear. But apparently one person's incompetence matters more than everyone else's time and money. Vincent felt something crack inside his chest, a hairline fracture in the armor he had spent decades building. These people didn't see him as a peer anymore. They saw him as a failure, a man who couldn't perform the most basic function of fatherhood despite all his wealth and power. The humiliation felt worse than any business loss he had ever experienced because it was so completely, devastatingly public. Across the aisle in seat 2B, a woman named Denise Hargrove, who sat on the board of directors for a Manhattan development Vincent desperately needed approval from, was typing rapidly on her tablet. Vincent couldn't see her screen, but he could imagine the messages she was sending, probably to colleagues, possibly about him, definitely nothing that would help his business prospects when he arrived in New York tomorrow morning for meetings that suddenly felt impossibly far away. Harper's cries escalated into shrieks that seemed to vibrate through the entire cabin. Vincent tried the bottle again. He tried rocking her. He tried whispering soothing sounds that felt ridiculous coming from his mouth. Nothing worked. Nothing even came close to working. He was completely, utterly powerless. The realization hit him like physical pain. Vincent Johnson, the man who controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in assets, who employed over 200 people, who had his name on buildings in 4 major cities, could not solve a problem that millions of ordinary parents handled every single day. Wealth meant nothing. Influence meant nothing. Authority meant nothing. He was just a desperate father failing in front of 200 witnesses who would remember this moment long after they forgot his name. Vincent looked down at Harper's red, tear-stained face and felt tears burning in his own eyes. This wasn't just about the flight anymore. This was about everything he didn't know, everything he had never learned, everything he had assumed he could buy his way past. And now, 35,000 feet above the country he had conquered in every other way, Vincent Johnson understood what it meant to be truly helpless. Bryan's legs felt unsteady as he stepped into the aisle, his worn sneakers silent against the carpeted floor. The distance between economy and first class couldn't have been more than 40 feet, but it stretched ahead of him like a minefield where every step might trigger an explosion he couldn't predict or control. He kept his hands visible at his sides, his posture deliberately non-threatening, his eyes focused straight ahead toward the sound of Harper's desperate crying. He had learned these things without anyone teaching him, the way prey animals learn to move carefully through dangerous territory. The passengers noticed him immediately. A middle-aged woman in seat 18D clutched her purse closer to her body as he passed, her eyes tracking his movement with the kind of vigilance people reserved for potential threats. A businessman in seat 15A looked up from his laptop, his expression shifting from neutral curiosity to something harder, more suspicious, as he registered Bryan's faded clothes and the way he moved with careful purpose toward first class. An elderly couple in seats 12B and C exchanged glances that Bryan pretended not to see, the kind of silent communication that said everything without words. Bryan's heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his throat. His palms were sweating. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, sit back down, make himself invisible again. But Harper's cries were getting worse, more desperate, and he couldn't unhear the pain in that sound. He kept walking. As Bryan approached the curtain separating economy from first class, a flight attendant named Jessica stepped smoothly into his path. She was younger than Cheryl, maybe late 20s, with blonde hair pulled into a ponytail and a smile that was professional but firm. Her body language was polite but positioned to block, not welcome. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice friendly but leaving no doubt that this was a question designed to redirect him back to his seat. Bryan swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "I think I can help with the baby," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over Harper's screams. Jessica's smile didn't change, but her eyes narrowed slightly, reassessing. "That's very kind, but the father has the situation under control," she said, which was obviously a lie that everyone on the plane knew was a lie. "Why don't you head back to your seat, and I'll let him know you offered." Bryan stood frozen for a moment, caught between retreat and persistence. Behind Jessica, he could see Vincent in seat 2A, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face gray with exhaustion, his daughter screaming against his chest. Bryan knew that if he walked away now, he would spend the rest of the flight listening to Harper suffer when he could have helped. He would arrive in Newark carrying that weight, knowing he had chosen safety over doing what was right. "Please," Bryan said, meeting Jessica's eyes directly. "I know what's wrong. I've done this before." Something in his tone must have registered because Jessica hesitated, her professional barrier wavering just slightly. She glanced back toward Vincent, then at Bryan, clearly calculating risks and protocols. Before she could respond, Vincent's voice cut through the tension, sharp and exhausted, and finished with everything. "This isn't the time," Vincent snapped without even looking up. "Please just go back to your seat." The words hit Bryan like a slap. Around Vincent, other first-class passengers were watching now with expressions that ranged from uncomfortable to openly hostile. Margaret Chen leaned toward Gordon Fisk and whispered something behind her hand. Denise Hargrove's eyes moved between Bryan and Vincent with the kind of scrutiny that made Bryan feel like he was being inventoried and found wanting. A man in seat 3A, whose name was Curtis Brennan, a corporate attorney who had defended companies against discrimination lawsuits, folded his arms across his chest and stared at Bryan with undisguised suspicion. Bryan felt his face burning. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. Every molecule in his body told him to turn around and walk away, to accept the dismissal and disappear back into the safety of being unseen. But Harper let out another scream, this one so sharp and desperate that it cut through every other sound on the plane, and Bryan thought about his cousins, Maya and Sophia, crying in pain, while adults who should have known better stood by helplessly. He took one more step forward, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "She's got gas trapped high in her chest," Bryan said quietly but clearly. "You're holding her at the wrong angle. If you let me show you, I can help her." Vincent finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and desperate and filled with something that might have been hope or might have been the last shred of his patience breaking. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Jessica's hand hovered near Bryan's shoulder, ready to guide him away if Vincent gave the word. Margaret Chen's expression had shifted from irritation to something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Curtis Brennan had his phone in his hand now, recording or ready to record, treating this moment like evidence he might need later. Bryan stood perfectly still, his heart pounding, his hands open and visible, waiting for Vincent to make a choice that would either allow help or confirm every assumption these passengers had already made about a poor black boy who had dared to cross an invisible line. Vincent stared at Bryan for 3 long seconds that felt like minutes. Every instinct he had developed over decades of business negotiations told him this was absurd, letting a stranger, a child, touch his daughter based on nothing but desperation and a quietly spoken claim. But Harper screamed again, her tiny body rigid with pain against his chest, and Vincent realized he had run out of pride, run out of options, run out of everything except the raw need to make his daughter stop suffering. "Go ahead," Vincent said finally, his voice hoarse and defeated. "Just please, if you know something, do it." Bryan stepped forward carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. "May I hold her?" he asked, extending his arms in a way that was both confident and respectful, waiting for explicit permission. Vincent transferred Harper into Bryan's arms, watching as the boy adjusted her position with a precision that seemed practiced and instinctive. Bryan shifted Harper so she was upright against his chest, her head resting on his shoulder, her body at a slight angle that Vincent had never seen anyone use before. Then Bryan placed his right hand flat against Harper's back, his fingers spread wide, applying steady pressure to a specific spot just below her shoulder blades. "She can't release the gas when she's horizontal or curved forward," Bryan explained quietly, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "The pressure builds up here, and it has nowhere to go. You have to hold her upright like this and press right where the diaphragm connects, then wait for her body to relax enough to let it move." As Bryan spoke, he began humming, a low, rhythmic melody that had no words but carried a soothing quality that seemed to vibrate through the air. It wasn't a lullaby, Vincent recognized, nothing from the expensive music classes Diane had researched. It was something older, simpler, the kind of sound that felt like it had been passed down through generations of people who learned to comfort children without books or classes or expert advice. Harper's scream cracked mid-wail, breaking into a hiccuping sob. Bryan adjusted his hand slightly, maintaining the pressure while continuing to hum. He swayed gently from side to side, not the bouncing motion Vincent had been doing, but a slow, steady rhythm that matched the melody he was humming. "Come on, sweet girl," Bryan whispered. "Let it go. You're okay. I got you." Harper's body, which had been rigid with tension for nearly 3 hours, began to soften. Her fists unclenched, her legs, which had been drawn up tight against her stomach, relaxed and dangled naturally. Vincent watched in stunned silence as his daughter's face, red and wet with tears, slowly smoothed into something approaching calm. Then Harper burped, a small sound that seemed impossibly ordinary given the chaos that had preceded it, and her crying stopped completely. The silence that followed felt like a physical presence in the cabin, thick and absolute. Vincent heard the hum of the airplane engines, a sound that had been drowned out for hours by Harper's screams. He heard someone cough 3 rows back. He heard the rustle of a magazine. He heard his own breathing, shallow and fast, as if he had been the one crying. Around them, passengers who had been rigid with irritation were frozen in postures of disbelief. Margaret Chen's mouth was open, her expression shifted from contempt to shock. Gordon Fisk had lowered his tablet, staring at Bryan and Harper with eyes that couldn't quite process what they were witnessing. Denise Hargrove had stopped typing, her hands suspended above her keyboard. Curtis Brennan had lowered his phone, the thread of documentation forgotten in the face of something he clearly hadn't expected to see. Jessica, the flight attendant who had tried to redirect Bryan, stood in the aisle with her hand pressed against her chest, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. Cheryl appeared from the galley, drawn by the sudden silence, her professional composure cracking into something that looked like wonder. Bryan continued humming softly, his hand still pressed against Harper's back. After another moment, Harper let out a long, shuddering sigh, and her eyes, which had been squeezed shut in distress, slowly opened. She looked up at Bryan's face with an expression of pure contentment, her tiny hand reaching up to rest against his neck. Then her eyes drifted closed again, and she fell asleep against his shoulder, her breathing deep and even and peaceful. Vincent felt something break loose in his chest, a knot of tension and fear and helplessness that suddenly released all at once. his vision blurred with tears he couldn't control. He pressed his hand against his mouth, trying to hold back the sob that wanted to escape, failing completely. He had spent 3 hours trapped in a nightmare of his own incompetence, judged by everyone around him, unable to help his own child. And this boy, this poor kid from economy class who everyone had looked at with suspicion, had solved it in less than 3 minutes. Bryan looked at Vincent, his expression gentle and understanding, completely without judgment. "She's okay now," Bryan said softly. "The gas was just stuck. Sometimes babies need help releasing it, that's all." Vincent stared at Bryan, at his daughter sleeping peacefully in this stranger's arms, at the cabin full of witnesses who had just watched their assumptions shatter. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. All he could do was nod, tears streaming down his face, while Harper slept and the plane carried them all toward New York through the quiet sky. Vincent wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to compose himself while Harper slept peacefully against Bryan's shoulder. "How did you know to do that?" Vincent asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you learn it?" Bryan shrugged slightly, careful not to disturb Harper. "I didn't really learn it anywhere official," he said. "My Aunt Lorraine had twin girls about 6 years ago, Maya and Sophia. They both had colic real bad, cried for hours every single day. My grandmother was watching them while my aunt worked. But Grandma Ruth's got arthritis in her hands and back, so holding babies for that long was really hard on her. I was 8, so I started helping." Vincent listened, aware that other passengers were leaning forward in their seats to hear. Margaret Chen had turned completely around. Gordon Fisk had removed his reading glasses. Even Curtis Brennan had moved closer to the aisle, his earlier suspicion replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like shame. "The doctors said it was just colic and it would pass eventually," Bryan continued, his voice matter-of-fact and unself-conscious. "But that didn't help when the babies were screaming at 2 in the morning and everyone had to be up for work or school in a few hours. So I started trying different things. I read articles at the library during lunch. I watched videos on the computers at school. I tried probably 20 different techniques before I figured out that the angle and the pressure point were what actually worked." Jessica, the flight attendant, had moved closer, listening intently. "That's incredible," she said softly. "Most adults never figure that out." Bryan looked slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "It's not that incredible," he said. "I just had to because nobody else had time to keep experimenting. My mom works double shifts at a packaging plant near Fresno. She's there from 6 in the morning until 8 at night most days, sometimes later. My grandmother takes care of me and my cousins, but she's 72 and her body hurts a lot. So when the twins were crying and nothing was working, I couldn't just give up because I was tired or frustrated. They needed help and I was the only one available who could keep trying." There was a quality to Bryan's explanation that struck Vincent deeply. No false modesty, no attempt to make himself sound heroic. Just a simple recounting of necessity and responsibility, of a child who became competent because incompetence wasn't an option his family could afford. Vincent thought about the nannies he had tried to hire, the expensive pediatric consultants Diane had on speed dial, the assumption that expertise could be purchased rather than earned through sleepless nights and patient observation. "How long did it take you to figure it out?" Denise Hargrove asked from across the aisle, her voice gentle in a way it hadn't been earlier. "About 4 months of every night after school," Bryan said. "The twins cried from around 5 in the evening until midnight usually. I'd come home, do my homework fast, then take one of them while my grandmother held the other. I kept a notebook of what I tried and what happened. Like a scientist, kind of. Eventually I noticed that when I held them upright at this specific angle and pressed right here, they'd burp and then calm down way faster. Once I figured that out, I could usually get them quiet in 5 or 10 minutes instead of hours." A woman in seat 4B, a pediatric nurse named Ramona Castellano, who had been silently furious about the noise for the past 3 hours, spoke up with genuine respect in her voice. "That's more systematic than most medical residents approach infant care," she said. "You essentially developed your own clinical trial at 8 years old." Bryan looked startled by the comparison. "I just didn't want my cousins to hurt anymore," he said simply. "And I didn't want my grandmother's hands to get worse from holding them wrong for so long." The cabin had transformed completely. The hostility that had filled the space 30 minutes ago had evaporated, replaced by a collective recognition that everyone present had fundamentally misjudged the quiet boy in faded clothes. Vincent saw it in Margaret Chen's face, the way her contempt had shifted to something that looked like regret. He saw it in Curtis Brennan's posture, the way the attorney had put his phone away completely and was listening with the kind of attention usually reserved for closing arguments. He saw it in Gordon Fisk's expression, shame mixing with reluctant admiration. Vincent realized he hadn't asked Bryan a single question about himself, hadn't even properly introduced himself or thanked him. He had been so trapped in his own crisis that he had treated Bryan like a service provider rather than a person. The recognition of his own behavior felt like another kind of failure, different from his inability to calm Harper, but equally important. "What's your name?" Vincent asked, though he already knew from their brief earlier exchange. "Bryan Wilson," Bryan said. "I'm 14. I'm flying to Newark to live with my Aunt Lorraine. She moved there last year and got a better job, so now she has room for me to stay with her and finish high school there." Vincent felt his throat tighten. "Where are you coming from?" "Fresno," Bryan said. "I've lived there my whole life. My mom and grandmother are still there with my younger cousins." "You're traveling alone," Vincent said, the reality of that settling over him with uncomfortable weight. "Yes, sir," Bryan said. "It's my first time on a plane." Vincent stared at this boy who had crossed the country alone, who had learned infant care through necessity, who had approached a hostile stranger to offer help despite knowing how it would look. "Tell me more," Vincent said quietly. "Tell me about your life." Vincent sat very still in seat 2A, watching Bryan gently transfer Harper back into his arms now that she was sleeping peacefully. The weight of his daughter felt different than it had 3 hours ago, heavier with the knowledge of his own inadequacy, lighter with the relief that she was finally at peace. Vincent had built an empire on the foundation of always having answers, always being the smartest person in the room, always maintaining control. In the span of 3 minutes, a 14-year-old boy from Fresno had demolished that foundation completely. Around him, the first-class cabin hummed with a different energy than before. Passengers who had been hostile were now quiet, reflective, some openly uncomfortable with their own earlier behavior. Vincent knew what he needed to do, what basic decency demanded, but the words stuck in his throat because saying them out loud meant admitting failure in front of everyone who defined his professional world. Margaret Chen sat 3 feet away. Gordon Fisk was right across the aisle. Denise Hargrove would be in his investor meeting tomorrow morning. These were people whose respect he needed, whose opinions could make or break deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But his daughter was sleeping peacefully for the first time in hours because a poor kid had been brave enough to help when no one else could. Vincent cleared his throat and stood up slowly, careful not to wake Harper. His legs felt unsteady. "I need to say something," Vincent said loudly enough for everyone in first class to hear. The conversations that had started to resume went quiet. "I owe everyone here an apology. My daughter was in distress and I couldn't help her. That affected all of you and I'm genuinely sorry for that." He turned to face Bryan directly, meeting the boy's eyes. "But mostly I owe you an apology," Vincent said, his voice cracking slightly. "When you came forward to help, I dismissed you. I was rude and ungrateful. You offered help and I treated you like you were a problem instead of a solution. That was wrong. That was completely wrong." Bryan looked deeply uncomfortable, his hands shoved into his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched. "You don't need to apologize," he said quietly. "You were stressed and tired. I get it." "No," Vincent said firmly. "I do need to apologize. Not because I was stressed, but because I made assumptions about you based on how you looked, where you came from, how old you are. I saw a kid from economy class and I didn't see someone who might actually know more than me. That's on me, not on the situation." The cabin was absolutely silent. Margaret Chen was staring at her hands folded in her lap. Curtis Brennan had his eyes closed, his jaw tight. Gordon Fisk was looking out the window at the clouds below, deliberately avoiding eye contact with anyone. Vincent could feel their discomfort radiating through the space, the collective recognition of shared prejudice that no one wanted to name but everyone could feel. "You saved my daughter from hours more of pain," Vincent continued, his voice steadier now. You did something I couldn't do with all my resources and education and money. You walked up here knowing exactly how it would look, knowing people would judge you, and you did it anyway because it was the right thing to do. That takes more courage than anything I've done in my entire career." Bryan shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly wanting this attention to end. "I just know about babies because I had to learn," he said. "It's not some big, heroic thing. Your daughter needed help and I knew how to give it. That's all." "That's not all," Vincent said quietly. "You could have stayed in your seat. You could have decided it wasn't your problem. Most people would have, but you didn't." Jessica, the flight attendant, stepped forward with tears on her cheeks. "I tried to stop you," she said to Bryan, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry. I should have listened when you said you could help." Bryan looked even more uncomfortable, if that was possible. "You were just doing your job," he said. "It's okay." "It's not okay," Ramona Castellano said, from seat 4B. "None of us gave you the benefit of the doubt. We all made assumptions. I'm a pediatric nurse, and I couldn't figure out what was wrong, but I still looked at you like you were a threat when you walked past my seat." Vincent watched Bryan's face, seeing the way the boy was processing this collective confession, the discomfort mixed with something that might have been vindication or might have been exhaustion. He wondered how many times Bryan had experienced this, how many times people had looked at him and seen threat instead of intelligence, poverty instead of capability, youth instead of wisdom. "I don't need everyone to feel bad," Bryan said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm glad Harper's okay. That's what matters." The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent into New York, requesting that everyone return to their seats and prepare for landing. Bryan looked relieved at the interruption, at the excuse to return to economy class and escape the weight of so much attention. "Wait," Vincent said. He pulled out his wallet, then stopped, realizing how insulting it would be to offer money for what Bryan had done. "Can I at least get your contact information?" Vincent asked instead. "Your aunt's address in Newark? A phone number? Something?" Bryan hesitated, then recited an address and phone number that Vincent typed into his phone with shaking hands. "Thank you," Vincent said, the words feeling completely inadequate. "Thank you for helping my daughter. Thank you for being braver than any of us." Bryan nodded, turned, and walked back down the aisle toward economy class, while the plane began its descent through the darkening sky toward New York. The plane touched down at John F. Kennedy International Airport at 11:37 p.m., the wheels hitting the runway with a gentle thump that barely stirred Harper from her peaceful sleep against Vincent's chest. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Vincent noticed how different the cabin felt compared to the tension that had saturated it hours earlier. The overhead lights came on, illuminating faces that had softened, passengers who moved with less urgency and more contemplation, as if the flight had changed something fundamental in how they saw the world. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, passengers stood to retrieve their luggage with unusual politeness. Margaret Chen waited patiently, instead of rushing to be first in line. Gordon Fisk helped an elderly woman in seat 5A lift her bag from the overhead compartment, something Vincent had never seen him do in years of flying together. Curtis Brennan stood quietly in the aisle, his earlier aggression replaced by something that looked like uncomfortable self-reflection. Vincent gathered Harper's things slowly, watching through the gap in the curtain as Bryan collected his patched backpack from under the economy seat. As passengers began filing toward the exit, Vincent saw something that made his throat tight. Ramona Castellano, the pediatric nurse, stopped at Bryan's row and squeezed his shoulder gently. "You're going to do great things," she said quietly. The woman from seat 18D, who had clutched her purse when Bryan walked past earlier, stopped and pressed a $20 bill into his hand. "For a meal in Newark," she said, her eyes wet. Bryan tried to refuse, but she closed his fingers around it firmly. Jessica, the flight attendant who had intercepted Bryan in the aisle, hugged him at the door of the plane. "I'm sorry I didn't trust you," she whispered. "You taught me something important tonight." Vincent waited with Harper until most of the passengers had deplaned, then made his way slowly up the jetway. Bryan was ahead of him, walking alone toward the terminal, with his backpack slung over one shoulder, looking small and tired under the harsh fluorescent lights. Vincent quickened his pace, careful not to jostle Harper. "Bryan," Vincent called. The boy turned, surprise crossing his face. Can we talk for a minute? They moved to the side of the gate area, away from the crowds rushing toward baggage claim and ground transportation. Vincent shifted Harper in his arms, suddenly unsure how to start a conversation that felt critically important, but completely outside his expertise. I wanted to ask you about your plans, Vincent said. You said you're living with your aunt in Newark to finish high school? Yes, sir, Bryan said. She's got a 2-bedroom apartment near the high school. The schools in Newark are supposed to be better than what we had in Fresno. I'm hoping I can maybe get into a good college if my grades are strong enough. What do you want to study? Vincent asked. Bryan shrugged, his expression careful. I don't really know yet, he said. Maybe something with helping people. Social work or teaching, I guess. Something where I could make things better for families like mine. Vincent felt something shift in his chest, recognizing the modesty in Bryan's dreams, the way the boy had been taught to want small things because larger ambitions seemed impossibly out of reach for someone in his position. What about scholarships? Vincent asked. Have you looked into those? A little, Bryan said, but most of them require test scores and activities I haven't been able to do because I've been working after school and taking care of my cousins. I'm going to try my best in Newark, though. My Aunt Lorraine says the guidance counselors there are pretty good at helping kids find opportunities. Vincent wanted to make promises, to offer to pay for Bryan's education, to fix the inequality that had shaped this boy's life with money and connections. But something stopped him, an awareness that grand gestures made in emotional moments often created complicated dynamics that helped the giver feel good more than they actually helped the recipient. Bryan didn't need a billionaire's charity. He needed genuine respect, real opportunity, and the kind of support that recognized his capability rather than his poverty. Can I stay in touch with you? Vincent asked instead. I'd like to know how things go in Newark. And if there's ever anything you need, advice about college applications, or anything else, I hope you'll reach out. Bryan studied Vincent's face, seeming to assess whether this was a polite gesture or a genuine offer. Okay, he said finally. Thank you. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the terminal buzzing with activity around them. Harper stirred slightly in Vincent's arms, making a soft sound before settling back into sleep. Bryan smiled at her, a gentle expression that transformed his whole face. She's really pretty, Bryan said. You're lucky. I know, Vincent said quietly. And I'm lucky you were on that flight. Bryan nodded, adjusted his backpack, and turned toward the signs pointing to ground transportation. Vincent watched him walk away, this thin kid in faded clothes carrying everything he owned, heading toward an uncertain future in a city he had never seen. The crowd swallowed him quickly, and Vincent stood alone with his sleeping daughter, feeling the weight of recognition settle over him like a coat he couldn't take off. He had learned something on that flight that no business school or boardroom had ever taught him. Real power wasn't about control or wealth or authority. It was about showing up with what you had when someone needed help, even when the entire world was watching and waiting for you to fail. 3 days after the flight, Vincent sat in a Manhattan boardroom on the 42nd floor of a building his company was negotiating to purchase. Harper slept peacefully in a carrier beside his chair, her tiny chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of healthy infant sleep. Across the table sat 6 investors whose approval Vincent needed to secure financing for the most ambitious expansion of his career. The presentation had gone well. The numbers were solid. The projections conservative enough to be credible but ambitious enough to be exciting. Then Harper woke up and started to cry. Vincent felt the familiar tension ripple through the room, saw the investors exchange glances that meant impatience and judgment. 6 months ago, maybe even 6 days ago, Vincent would have panicked. He would have called for a break, handed Harper to an assistant, done anything to maintain the illusion of perfect control. Instead, he stood calmly, lifted Harper from the carrier, and adjusted her position the way Bryan had shown him, upright against his chest, slight angle, firm pressure on her back just below the shoulder blades. Harper burped softly and settled against him, her crying fading to quiet contentment. Impressive, said Denise Hargrove from her seat at the end of the table, a slight smile on her face. Vincent met her eyes and saw understanding there, recognition of how much had changed on that flight from Los Angeles. He continued his presentation with Harper in his arms. no longer treating fatherhood and leadership as separate identities that couldn't coexist in the same space. The meeting ended with tentative approval pending final contract review. As the investors filed out, Denise lingered. "That was quite a flight we shared," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about it a lot. About the assumptions I made." "Me too," Vincent said. "Have you stayed in touch with that boy?" Denise asked. "Bryan," Vincent said. "His name is Bryan Wilson. And yes, I called him yesterday. He's settling into his aunt's place in Newark, starting school next week." "Good," Denise said. She paused at the door. "You're different now." "Better." She left before Vincent could respond. 400 miles away, Bryan sat at a small kitchen table in his Aunt Lorraine's apartment in Newark, filling out paperwork for his new high school. The apartment was clean but cramped, the furniture worn but comfortable, the walls thin enough that he could hear the neighbors arguing upstairs. His aunt was at work, her third shift at a hospital where she worked as a nursing assistant. Bryan was alone with his thoughts and a stack of forms asking about his interests, his goals, his dreams. In the box labeled Future Career Aspirations, Bryan paused. A week ago, he would have written something modest and safe. Teacher maybe. Social worker. Something that seemed achievable for someone like him. Instead, he thought about the plane, about the moment when he had stood up despite every instinct telling him to stay invisible. He thought about Vincent's face when Harper finally stopped crying, about Ramona Castellano telling him he had approached infant care like a clinical researcher, about the way those wealthy passengers had looked at him with respect instead of suspicion once they understood what he knew. Bryan wrote pediatric medicine in careful letters, then sat back and looked at the words. They didn't seem impossible anymore. They seemed like a destination he could actually reach if he worked hard enough, if he stayed brave enough, if he remembered that expertise came from experience and compassion as much as from expensive education. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Vincent, a photo of Harper sleeping peacefully with a caption that read, "Used your technique in a board meeting today. Worked perfectly. Thank you again." Bryan smiled and saved the photo, not because he needed validation from a billionaire, but because it felt good to be seen as someone whose knowledge mattered, whose help had lasting value. Over the following weeks, Vincent found himself changing in ways that surprised him. He listened more in meetings, asked questions instead of assuming he knew answers, recognized expertise in unexpected places. He hired a woman from the mailroom to join his executive team after noticing how efficiently she solved logistical problems no one else had figured out. He started a mentorship fund at his company specifically for employees from disadvantaged backgrounds, not as charity but as recognition that talent existed everywhere if you were willing to look past assumptions. Bryan started high school in Newark and discovered that being seen, truly seen, gave him a kind of confidence he had never experienced before. He joined the science club. He talked to the guidance counselor about college preparation programs. He made friends who didn't treat him like he was invisible. The plane had changed something fundamental in how he moved through the world, not because what he did was heroic, but because doing it had taught him that his knowledge and courage had value, even when the entire world seemed designed to tell him otherwise. The moment they shared at 35,000 feet became a private compass for both of them, a reminder that true authority came from care and competence, not from wealth or position. Vincent carried it into boardrooms and business deals, remembering that power meant nothing if you couldn't help the people who actually needed you. Bryan carried it into classrooms and conversations, remembering that he had faced down suspicion and judgment to do what was right, and survived. Years later, when Harper was old enough to understand, Vincent would tell her about the flight to New York, about the boy from Fresno who saved her from hours of pain. He would tell her that the most important lesson he ever learned came from a 14-year-old kid in faded clothes who knew more about taking care of people than Vincent had learned in 4 decades of success. And Harper would grow up understanding that wisdom lived everywhere, that help came from unexpected places, and that the measure of a person had nothing to do with money and everything to do with whether they stood up when someone needed them, even when standing up meant risking everything.